So let's start with the topic of today's session. Let's discuss Pennycook's paper. As you know, this paper is not about variables or varieties or about language change in progress. This paper is about political issues. In Unit 1, we deal with issues of language use, and language use is necessarily political. It's political because it's got to do with social relationships that involve a dimension of power. This chapter in particular focuses on the relationships between English and its users, English and other languages, and English in its multiple contexts of use. So, what's the issue that the author finds problematic? Take some time to think about the answer. What is the issue that the author finds problematic? The answer here is the global spread of English, or the spread of English as a global language. And he presents 6 frameworks or 6 perspectives from which we can look at the spread of English. So here comes the first question, or I open the floor for any volunteer who'd like to talk about the first perspective, colonial celebration, or the view that he calls colonial celebration. Is there any volunteer who'd like to activate their mic and try their hands at explaining what colonial celebration means? Anybody? The person who was missing interaction. What about you?
Hello.
Hello, this is Eugenio.
Yes, I can give it a try.
Okay, Eugenio, good for you.
So the position of colonial celebration is very controversial one because it basically glorifies in a way English and puts it as a language that is in a way more important or that is superior to others by proposing that language has some qualities that actually elevate it above other languages, and that is the reason why English should be a global language. It should be spread, and it should be I don't want to repeat important in the eyes of others, of everyone, but that's basically the idea.
Excellent, Eugenio. Thank you for your contribution. Eugenio, what are some of those supposedly outstanding characteristics that make English a superior language?
I don't recall them word by word, but if I remember correctly, one of those was the characteristic of English of acquiring words very easily and coining new words and new terms without much trouble, as if that's something that other languages can't do, or if that's something that other languages would find problem doing.
Exactly, or as if that characteristic, having a large vocabulary, was necessary for any language.
Or makes it inherently better.
Exactly. So, claiming that English is superior because it has a large vocabulary, or because its vocabulary got bigger and bigger and bigger, thanks to England's colonial history, is like saying that German is better for philosophy because well, that German is better for philosophy than other languages. Okay, the fact that Western philosophers write about philosophy in German simply proves that Germany produced many philosophers. So in order to have certain visibility in the field and in order to be taken into consideration by great philosophers, people had to write about philosophy in German. You see my point?
Yes.
And the only thing that proves is that Germany produced lots of philosophers. Having a large vocabulary with lots of borrowings simply shows that England was a huge imperial power.
It's like saying that Latin is better for education because it was used as the language of education by many countries, by many nations throughout history, which, well, any language that meets the needs of the speakers is a good language and it works.
Exactly, exactly, absolutely. So this perspective that glorifies English as a superior language is a pretty ridiculous one, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Eugenio, so much
Thank
for
you.
your contribution. The other or one, let's say the second perspective that Pennycook deals with is what he calls laissez-faire liberalism, or we can just call it liberalism. Is there anybody else that would like to try their hands at explaining to the rest of the class what liberalism means here? Apart from Eugenio. Eugenio has participated already, so now he takes a break. And I do too. Anybody? You're shy, guys. I thought I was a
Sorry.
shy person. Julieta.
Hello.
Hello, Julieta.
Yes. I had quite a difficult time trying to understand this perspective, but what I was able to grasp was the idea that this perspective takes a more simplistic view towards the global spread of English, suggesting that we should have freedom of choice regarding our thoughts towards the global spread of English, and that there's like no sort of problem or issue with the global spread of English, that English should be used for international uses while other languages for local uses, and there is no problem with that fact or that view. But what I didn't understand was if that is correct. I mean, what it states is that there's no problem with the global, basically there's no problem, there's no issue with the global spread of English, and everyone can do whatever they please.
Yes, yes, you understood it. You understood it. Here, the claim is what many language professionals say. I just teach English. There's nothing political about it. There are no political consequences or social consequences of my teaching a foreign language. And what they don't see is that having that stance, a neutral or an apolitical stance, is actually a stance, a liberal one, okay? And the idea here is that the spread of English does have consequences on the lives of people and on the relationships among peoples and on the relationship between English and other languages. Because, like you said, if we do what these advocates of liberalism say and everybody decided that using English as a global language for international communication is the best idea, and we decided to use local languages only for minor businesses, then there would be an imbalance in the values, in the importance of the languages, and the languages that are less valued because they are used for unimportant issues, they may eventually not just lose value, but eventually disappear. They fall into disuse because they're not important, because we can use English for everything else that matters.
So liberalists acknowledge the fact that English is an important language and acknowledges its global spread, but it doesn't make it their concern.
Exactly. Rather than acknowledging the fact that English is a global language, they advocate for it to become global, for it to become the language of international communication. Yes,
thank you.
Definitely. And Pennycook mentions a very famous linguist who has become like the visible face of liberalism, David Crystal. He's very famous. There are books by him at our library. Some of them are very beautiful with great images. They're very appealing, and the message is a very insidious one. Because, like I said, people that take this perspective say, this is not our business. But in saying this is not our business, they are giving carte blanche for English to spread and to become the language of communication without any checks, without taking into consideration the possible impacts that may have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julieta. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the third view. This is, here I expect lots of people to volunteer, because this is the language ecology view. Guys, you're surrounded by the discourse of ecology and ideas about preservation and diversity. So any volunteer who'd like to explain to us what the language ecology perspective is?
I can try.
Morning, Juncos. What's your first name?
Sorry, I joined with the with my informal email account. My name is Maria.
Maria. Okay, Maria.
Yes. All right. So this framework is about the spread of English, and that the spread of English is dangerous to some contexts, let's say, and that we should preserve certain languages. There is this metaphor about habitats in which languages become endangered because of the introduction of different species, in this case, English. Well, that's what I understood about this framework.
Okay, great. So this is the metaphor of ecology and biodiversity applied to the domain of languages. That's why you hear terms like, or you read terms like language ecology. This is an ecology, a system in which an equilibrium exists between different languages, and languages are interrelated, and they have like different roles or places in that ecology, right? Now, Pennycook finds problems with this metaphor that is applied to languages. Think about the following. Consider the case of well-meant missionaries that go to a remote place to work with a tribe. And these missionaries implement, because they have honestly good intentions, they implement literacy programs using their own language. For example, English or Spanish, but let's use English because we're talking about English. Now, when the children in that tribe learn to read and write in English, they may find out that they have good opportunities, good job opportunities. So they may eventually leave their village to find better opportunities to make a living. What is the effect? What is the unforeseen effect that applying literacy programs has had on that village? The local language falls into disuse and eventually it may disappear. So some scholars, some thinkers that endorse the language ecology view would say things like, we need to protect these local languages, we need to preserve diversity, and we need to resist the advance of English in these contexts. But what they forget is that societies and the people living in those societies can make their own decisions because they are agents. So societies can choose what languages are taught, and there are bodies that make those decisions, like the Ministry of Education. And people, also as individual agents, they can choose if, given certain choices, they want to learn a given language, and if a given language is beneficial for them. So do these children in a remote place, do they have the obligation to avoid English, even if English gives them better life opportunities? Don't they have the right to make their own choices? Do they really need their indigenous language? Can't they decide whether they want to use their indigenous language? That is a problem that Pennycook finds with this initially appealing idea, but an idea that doesn't seem to work very well when you take into account the fact that people are agents that can make decisions for themselves. Professor Galvani very recently gave her postgraduate thesis dissertation. She passed and she graduated. How long ago, Gemma? 15 days ago.
14 days ago.
14 days ago. She has worked with a group of... Okay, Gemma, you tell the students yourself, because you can do this much better than I can, and I get a rest.
I worked with an Aboriginal community in the south of San Juan, a Huarpe community. Not many researchers have worked there, so thank you. So it's a vast field, and well, I found out that in terms of conception, there is dominance of English over Spanish and over the ancestral language. Now, the community, what I was able to see is they are actually interested in keeping and preserving the ancestral language. They actually show interest, but at the same time, they have extremely positive ideas about English, and they show an extreme interest in learning English. I mean, most of you, or many, might be working in teaching English, and you know that sometimes you do not find students who are so interested in learning English, mainly when they are 15, 14, 16, 17, they really do not tend to show that much interest. Well, this is not the case. And this was actually surprising because I thought, well, I'm going to a school in the middle of the countryside, 80 kilometers from the capital of San Juan. So I really wasn't expecting to find students so interested in learning English. And that's actually what I found. They are all the time attempting to learn English, even when the teachers seem to think what I thought, that English is not important for them. I mean, that they would not be interested. So I ended up finding out that the teachers are not interested in teaching them English, but that the students are interested in learning English. So, and here you have the Philipson's view that English, I mean, you can apply this controversy or this discussion somehow between Philipson and Pennycook, because Philipson says, well, English linguistic hegemony characterizes the English teaching profession, and it is through the beliefs, purposes, and activities typical of this profession that English keeps the role of the dominant language. However, in this case, the arguments that promote English as a superior language do not seem to come from the English teachers, but from the home environment. And why do I say that it comes from the home environment? Well, because the place where this school is located, where I carry out, and where the Huarpe community is home to one of the, or many of the biggest limestone quarries. I don't know if you know what they are. Son mineras productoras de cal. So this, where the Huarpe community is, I mean, and even most of the inhabitants of where the Huarpe community is, and actually the members of the Huarpe community, work in those limestone quarries. So, and those limestone quarries are owned by foreigners who speak English to communicate, and at the same time are all the time visited by engineers and people from all over the world who come to see and to work there. So the people from the community are extremely aware of how important learning English can be for them, and the possibilities that are open to them or that they are given by learning English. So the students, even when they are 11, 12, they know exactly why English is important for them. I mean, learning English gives them possibilities to work in those limestone quarries and to get better job positions than the ones that can be obtained without learning English or without knowing English in those plants. As I was saying, when Philipson, for example, says that usually the English profession is the one that keeps, or the English teachers keep to contribute to the role of English as a dominant language. In this case, the interest and the interest in learning English seems to come from the students and from the home environment. So
exactly. They have a motivation, a drive.
So Pennycook's critics to Philipson's view that the notion of linguistic imperialism may lack a sense of agency seems to be somehow pertinent, or it's clearly applied in this case.
Exactly.
Since the choices to learn English do not seem to be an ideological reflection of linguistic imperialism, but a conscious willingness to appropriate the language, and which is strictly related to the social cultural context where the community is.
Sorry, Gemma, I wanted to ask you something about the Aboriginal perspective that they have towards their Aboriginal language. Could you see something related to language ecology there? Do they try to preserve or just want to learn English and forget about their roots?
No, I mean, there is no somehow opposition between English and the ancestral language. However, there is some, I don't know if it's opposition, but some negative ideas are held towards the standard variety of Spanish. And we may discuss this in another lesson, but the point is, as they do not speak the standard, their ancestral language fluently anymore. What they believe to have remained of the ancestral language is only traces of the language in the variety of Spanish they speak. So, learning the standard variety of Spanish, or actually the standard variety of Spanish for them, is perceived as a threat to their ancestral language, or what they believe to have remained of the ancestral language. Because actually we do not know if the variety of Spanish actually presents traces of the ancestral language.
So,
thank you.
So their ancestral language is no longer spoken fluently. There is little to preserve except for these expressions that
we don't even know if they
appear in their Spanish.
And we don't even know if there are actually speakers. They say they are. I haven't found them yet. I'm still looking for them. And I know some people who speak, but they actually have some set phrases or sentences or somehow said, but just 2 or 3 sentences, and that's all there is. And they always repeat the same.
Right. Right. So Florencia Abaca here made a comment that is the social and material value of English in that particular society. Exactly. For the group Gemma studied, English represents a real opportunity to get a job and to get in touch with the people that has the supply of jobs for the community. So definitely it has a high value. And thank you, Gemma. Thank you very much for sharing your findings in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Hi. I found a problem with this perspective that I think is related to Pennycook's problem of what is natural.
Yeah.
Because applying this metaphor or concept of well, ecology to language arises concepts like the natural selection and the survival of the fittest. That would mean that if English is pushing out other languages of the system, is sad because we
Of
lose
the
them,
ecology.
but yes, it is sad because we lose them, but it would mean that they would be growing or following the natural course of events that would happen in a in a in a habitat where one species is introduced and finds a place to thrive.
Right. Let's see, Maria Julia, if I got you right. What you're saying is that this metaphor of, or this ecological metaphor applied to the field of languages leads to the wrong sort of conclusions when we reason,
Yes,
when we think about a language that has disappeared. We say like, oops, it was natural selection.
yes, I think that applying it for the aiming at conserving languages may be actually the other way around, because in an ecology, in this system, when something dies out, it was replaced by something better in biological terms,
Right.
or something that could survive certain
Right.
problems.
Right. Now, in this particular case, the problem is, as Hema insisted, we don't see the concept of agency being involved. Agency here means social groups, societies, or individuals can act. That is, to be an agent, to be able to act. And in this view, we don't see that. We don't see people acting, making decisions, and accepting the consequences of their decisions. Okay, I choose to speak English because it's good for my job prospects. My entire group chooses the same, and we face the consequence of our ancestral language vanishing out. But what we see here instead is a group of people, thinkers, scholars, some linguists that say, no, it doesn't matter what you want. What is important is that we preserve your language. And the other people may say, well, I don't want my language if it's not useful for me. I want the language that will give some advantages for me, not for you. In her presentation, Hema also touched upon the next framework that is also very closely related to this one, the linguistic imperialism perspective. In this next perspective, or from this next perspective, from the linguistic imperialism perspective, English is seen as the dominant language, and all the other languages in a subordinate position, as oppressed languages. And the contribution that this perspective makes is that of thinking that the dominant, the hegemonic position of English is related to corporations and organizations that use English and that promote the use of English, not just teachers of English, but important world-level global organizations that promote its use, like the British Council. Of course, this dominant hegemonic position of English poses a threat to the other local, less important languages too. And as Hema mentioned in her brief presentation, this view also lacks the idea of agency. Let's move on to, I don't know which number is this, I think it's 5. Let's move on to the human rights perspective. Is there any volunteer who'd like to briefly comment what this is?
I have a question.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. In most of, I think in most of these types of ideologies, let's say, at the end they mention the answer to 2 questions related to, for example, in the language ecology, it says that at the end, in the views of linguistic diversity as a political issue, no, let me find it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, guide
Guida.
us. Tell us what page you're looking at.
Yes, I'm at the end, at the middle of page 112. In the last paragraph.
Yeah.
And in all of the views, it talks about an answer to 2 questions. And I don't seem to fully understand when Pennycook answers these questions. I cannot seem to fully understand what is trying to be said, let's say.
Okay. He's exploring what are the what contributions these perspectives make to understand the ideological or the political impact that the spread of English has. So, for example, when discussing the liberal perspective, he says that liberals don't ask any question about the political consequences of the spread of English, so they don't, let alone they don't answer any question about that. When considering, for example, which is the one you were asking about?
The one of ecology.
Ecology.
So, for example, at the beginning of the last paragraph, it says it addresses the first. It's talking about the first question, in terms by and large of an appeal to environmentalism and preservation.
It addresses the first meaning of ideology that he presented at the very beginning of the chapter.
Oh, okay.
He says, in that first meaning, he says ideology is, or the ideological consequences mean or stands for political consequences of the spread of English. Okay? In that view of the first 2 definitions of ideology that he offers at the beginning of the paragraph, you need to reread these final paragraphs in each section. Okay?
Yes.
Okay. So some of these perspectives attempt to offer an answer to the political consequences of the spread of English from their own perspective. And others don't care about the political implications of the spread of English. That's the point he's making.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah,
Tell
what
me.
I want to say that the paper is organized around those two senses of ideological implications. So he presents all of the frameworks and he provides a very short description of them. And then at the end, he makes this sort of conclusion in which he addresses both of the ideological implications. So you have to pay attention to both. The one that is regarding political status and the one that has to do with the direct discursive effects. So that is why you will find that in each of the frameworks. It has to do with the organization of the paper pretty much. It's kind of difficult to follow at first, but if you reread it, it's going to be a bit more clear, probably.
So to add to what Camila says, the second sense in which ideological is used or presented at the very beginning of the chapter is to do with the ideological or the discursive impact of the spread of English. For example, does the spread of English bring about or carries with it, with English, ideas about the superiority of the English language? Are those ideas about the English language, or do those ideas about the English language travel together with English? So when English spreads out to other communities, do those ideas of superiority also spread out with English? That is the second sense of ideological that Pennycook discusses. And in some of these frameworks, that issue is not dealt with, and in some of these frameworks, that issue is addressed and attacked. Okay, Joaquin?
Yes, now it's clear. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I hope it's clearer when you reread
Yes,
the
yes.
paper. It'll take a couple of readings, I'm sure.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
So let's move quickly to the last perspective, the language rights framework. This view adds the concept of linguistic human rights, which are not respected as long as dominant global languages like English or Spanish advance. This is the idea that is defended in this perspective. So from this perspective, there is a call to support diversity and to respect people's fundamental linguistic human rights, to maintain and to develop their mother tongues. Again, Pennycook finds problems with this perspective, and in his view, this perspective is based on the belief that dignity and identity are essentially connected to one's own language. I'm going to talk about essentialism or an essentialist view in a minute, so hold that idea. And next, Pennycook presents his own position. He acknowledges that there are perspectives that make interesting contributions. He does not discard them totally. He takes some positive ideas, but he offers an idea that he presents as better, as more encompassing, and or better to understand the impact of the spread of English in the world. So he borrows the concept of performativity from Judith Butler, who studied gender issues. And to the concept of performativity, he adds the concept post-colonial. Performativity is to do with the idea that in social affairs, in social issues, there isn't a permanent essence. So if you consider gender, for example, there isn't a permanent essence to being a woman. You are not in essence, a woman. You act like a woman and you do womanness. You do activities associated with women, and your behavior is conditioned by expectations that others have about what it means to be a woman. So you're an agent that acts like a woman. For example, by wearing certain items of clothing, by buying and consuming what women usually buy and consume, by speaking the way women are expected to speak. So by doing all these things, you do womanness. You act like a woman. And in so doing, you construct your gender identity. Gender is not an essence of a person. It's something that agents perform, do. Similarly, we can apply the same reasoning to countries, societies, or social groups. So instead of thinking about Quechua speakers who live in Cordoba and decide to use Quechua only at home, instead of thinking of them as oppressed, we could think of them, or we could think about them as agents who make their own decisions. So for some reason, they decide to use Spanish in the public sphere and Quechua at home only. In using Quechua at home only, rather than in public, they are constructing their Quechua identity. That is the way in which they shape their identity, part of their identity. So what Pennycook is saying is that English is not bad in itself. People do different things with English. For instance, there are researchers that choose not to publish their findings in English, and instead they use their local languages as a symbol of resistance against the advance of English. But on the other hand, my friends who are sociologists and demographers, my own friends, I'm talking about real friends, right? They choose to give their presentations in conferences in English, in whatever English they can produce, a broken English, a transformed English, an English with a Cordobese and a Riojano accent. Imagine that English, full of structures that are, well, the English they can produce. That English is not perfect, but that is a transformed English. That is good enough for their goals. And it's good enough for them to communicate to other people interesting things about our local reality. So what they're doing is they're appropriating English. They are agentively making it their own version of English to forward their goals. And they transform English. They don't use RP pronunciation. They don't use standard English all the time. They use whatever English they can. So they adapt English to their goals. And then when they come back from their conferences, they say, Javier, how do you say this and that? Like this. Oh, I didn't say it like that. Did you get your goals? Did you communicate what you wanted to communicate? Yes. Okay, that's good enough. Don't be so stressed about it. My point here is social agents can appropriate, adapt, and transform English and use it to do what they need to do. And that does not necessarily mean that they are contributing to the disappearance of Spanish. And that doesn't mean that they are necessarily violating linguistic human rights. They are making their own decisions. There are Chinese activists, and you can watch them on YouTube if you're curious. These activists choose English to address world leaders and to demand that immediate action is taken to stop the atrocious actions that the Chinese regime is carrying out. Of course, they could speak Mandarin and hire an interpreter, but they choose not to use their mother tongue to send a political message, and they choose English instead. So my point here is the uses and meanings of the uses of English, and the meanings of using English are not universal, and they are different, and the meanings that are evoked by using English in San Juan are different from those that are generated by using English in China. Okay, and we need to consider the uses of English on a case-by-case basis, paying attention to the particularities of each political context. So Pennycook invites readers to take a look at the world and to notice that the world is full of mixtures, hybridity, mestizajes, all these kinds of transformed Englishes used by different agents. And we're a little bit short of time, but I wanted to tell you the story of Sri Lankan English. In Sri Lanka, there are different ethnic groups, and one of them use a mixture of English with their own language, again, to send a political message and to gain the prestige that they cannot gain in any other way. So for some groups in Sri Lanka, using English words every now and then is very positive. And what they are doing is resisting a different oppressor who happens to speak a different language, not English. Actually, the oppressor prohibited the use of English in public spaces or in official institutions. You see my point? You see Pennycook's point? No, it's not mine. It's Pennycook's point. Pennycook is saying, let's admit that there are crossovers, there are mixtures, and let's admit that English is not universally bad. There may be cases of imperialism, but that is not every single, the characteristic of every single context in which English is used as a foreign language or as a second language.
Javier, sorry,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to add an example. Sorry, of maybe you have seen this series Unorthodox of this woman who is Jewish. Have you? Well,
No,
maybe the rest of the audience. The mother of the protagonist, she left the Jewish community because she was tired, because among other things, and she begins to speak in English, even though she lives in Germany, in Berlin. And when the other Jewish people went to see her, they spoke in their language. Gidis, I think that it's the name, and she tells them, "We here speak in English, even though they are living in Germany." They have an attitude towards German. Yeah, I cannot pronounce it, and they prefer. Yes, they prefer to speak in English because they have left their Jewish roots and they don't want to speak in German either. So that is maybe a case in which English is helping this agent to show her ideology towards her own.
Definitely.
Right, right.
And also, it emphasizes the idea of agency that includes people doing something. Whenever explaining this position, I think Javier used many verbs that sort of have this connotation of somebody doing something. And also, the post-colonial performativity view has this connotation of people being aware and conscious of what they are doing when they choose to use English. So
not just adapting because they are with the flow. They are doing something with the language.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, Rocio, I think I interrupted your contribution. Can you repeat what you said?
It's okay, I have just finished.
Okay.
That people doing something with the language, not just going with the flow because it's their English and we speak it. It's just using it, doing something.
Exactly, exactly. So if there are people who agentively appropriate English because it enables them to attain goals and to index, to point at meanings like resistance or sophistication, is the spread of English universally and inevitably something bad? If a particular group in Sri Lanka, the Tamils, if they have Tamilized their English, they have transformed English, the English they use, does that mean that the spread of English inevitably leads to homogenizing languages and cultures? A question for you to think about, guys. Then I'd like to very briefly take a look at some of the images you shared on Moodle last week. And it would be a good idea for you to go to Moodle right now, to open the forum and be ready to take a look at some of these images. Meanwhile, while you do that, I'd like to thank and congratulate everybody who contributed and those of you who commented the photos and the images. The contributions are very, very interesting. Some people like Etel Loza and Riso Patron. Guys, you surprised us. What you did was mind-blogging. These people used Google Street View to get images of actual shop windows. I wouldn't have thought of that. So that was a great idea, and your contributions were very interesting as well. So if you're on Moodle, I'd like you to go to Carneluti's image. So first of all, notice, I hope you're there, guys. Carneluti is spelled C-A-R-G-N. Fabrizio, there you go. Great image.
Yes, here I am.
Fabrizio, the first thing we can notice here is that the text we found is on a wall, but we don't know if it's the wall of an institution, of a building of an institution, or the wall of a private house. Do you know where it is?
I'm not sure. Problems. The stream is quite stiff. I think it's just a private building.
Okay. Okay. Can you identify what genre this text belongs to? Is it, what would you call it? Is it a news article? Is it a poem? Is it a video clip? What would you call the text you found?
I'd say it's a graffiti, a mural.
Yeah, that's a graffiti. So, like most graffitis, this graffiti is anonymous. We don't know who the text producer is, but we can say something about the text receivers. Fabricio, who do you think the text producer had in mind when she or he produced this text? What he or she had, who he or she had in mind as an addressee? How would you describe the potential text receiver?
I think the potential text receiver could be any citizen of Córdoba, but also it's probably targeted at a younger audience, who are probably most knowledgeable in English, so they can receive that message.
Actually, exactly. Actually, any city of Córdoba can walk by the text, but not any city of Córdoba will understand and appreciate the text. So the potential addressee is someone who knows English.
Right.
Fabricio, is writing on the walls a transgression?
Not inherently, I think, but
are there norms that forbid writing on the walls of private houses or the buildings of institutions?
Oh, I'm not sure, but I think if you're not the owner of that place, you shouldn't.
Exactly. So that is a form of transgression. And what about using English in a community in which the use of Spanish is expected? Is that a transgression?
No, I think English is already embraced in the Argentinian community, especially in the city of Córdoba.
Any reaction to that from the rest of the audience?
I don't think it's a transgression. I think it's a matter of choice.
Yeah, well, but a choice, a transgression can be a choice, definitely. Like, for example, now you see this as part of your landscape, as there's nothing unusual about men wearing rings or earrings. But when I was a child, choosing to wear earrings was a transgression, simply because it was not expected of men to wear earrings. In that sense, it was a transgression. So wouldn't you say that if in a community in which Spanish is the language the greatest majority speaks and Spanish is the official language of the country, wouldn't you say that writing something on the wall in English is a little bit of a transgression? In this sense, in the sense that it breaches expectations. Well, actually, I see that I'm insisting on the same question, but maybe you see English being used in graffiti a lot. So to you, it is part of the landscape. Maybe I have to admit that.
Yeah, I think especially as graffiti being a sort of imported form of art, being in English is more natural to it.
Right. So the use of English that you find here in graffiti, in this particular case and in other cases, connects the text producer with certain kinds of text receivers. Like you said, young people who can understand English. So this use of English can have some connotations, or some connotations that are interpretable and recognizable, like being associated with young people. Let's consider very quickly, because I know we're reaching the our time limit. Let me very briefly say a few words about many other texts that you guys contributed in the forum. There are lots of images that come from restaurants, walls of restaurants, menus, flyers, etc., etc. I'd like you to think about the following. What products are associated, or the consumption of which products, or the consumption of what products is associated with those uses of English? Gym lessons, parties after football matches, sushi, beer, and hamburgers with exotic flavors, expensive makeup, designers' clothes, in general, products that are expensive. Think about the geographic location of most of those shops or stores that used English. They are located in very affluent parts of the city, and they are located in a part of the city where many young students live. Then think about the assumptions about who can understand those texts, who are the potential text receivers and potential consumers of those products. Certainly not the lower classes, not the working classes, but the middle and upper middle classes. So the uses of English that you have detected have this, these uses of English evoke meanings of sophistication, refinement, like you said, youth, but also there are social class associations. Therefore, these stores using English are aligning themselves with a particular kind of audience. The audience that can spend a lot on a glass of beer or a lot on a piece of cloth to cover their mouths and noses. Of course, it's not only the use of English that sends the message, we are young and we are sophisticated. It's the use of English together with many other things, like the colors, the use of a particular social media app, the filters that are used in the photos, the objects that are promoted, etc., etc. It's a number of things that point, that index in the same direction, in the direction of youth, modernity, having an urban quality, and using English and all these other resources that I've mentioned. Also, like I said, they align the stores with their potential customers, but they also distinguish the stores from the rest, from those that don't or cannot use English. So English also here has a meaning of distinction. There are a few things that some students have said that I disagree with. For example, the idea that English is more valued than Spanish in our community. If that was the case, Spanish would be on the way out. Both are valued, and what we can say is that English is probably the most valued foreign language. That is what your data reveals. But we cannot say that it's more valued than Spanish, guys. Before we, probably there's something else that I'm forgetting to say now because we're short of time, but before we leave, previously in my presentation I mentioned, or we talked about the disappearance of languages. Consider what may bring about the disappearance of a language, what may cause the disappearance of a language. We mentioned, for example, the introduction of a foreign language in a language ecology. For example, the case of English in a language ecology may cause a language to vanish, right? But a key element in the preservation of a language is the linguistic socialization of children. So if you want to make a language disappear, what do you do? Exactly. That sounds very perverse. And that is what China is doing to some minorities. In these next couple of days, we will post a couple of videos on Moodle, videos about languages that are dying out, including the language of the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are a Muslim minority in China, and they are being locked down by the Chinese regime, and their children are being taken away from their parents so that they don't learn their language, their religion, or their culture. Of course, this will eventually lead to the disappearance of the language of the Uyghurs and their culture altogether. Very little is known about what the Chinese regime is doing to this and to other minorities. So this is a good opportunity for you to learn about the world and to learn something about a country which our school has become so close to. To end on a happier note, I'd like to repeat my congratulations and my thanks to all of you who made contributions: Sabate, Aguirre, Surco Aparicio, Ludueña, Zaloco, Vaccarini, Racing, Banquio, Mozano, Galarza, and I have my list here in my notes. Banquio del Vaso, Hércole, Juncos, Campaña. Campaña wrote a very interesting comment in her post, so go read it. She makes a very good point about the use of English by a particular company. And a very important question was asked by Rocio. You need to consider on each occasion that in which English is used, you need to consider if people are using English acritically, innocently, following a trend, or in the case of these shops that use English, are they just following a trend because everybody else writes English in their Instagram posts? Or are they using strategically a resource that has the connotation of distinction and is associated with lots of positive meanings to attract consumers? That is something that can be done with English too, by using English. So lots of questions, guys, for you to think about. There are questions about other stuff here. We're gonna try to answer them if they are very pressing questions. And about the term test, what I can tell you is that you're gonna have a term test. We need to define lots of things about the term test, as you can imagine, okay? So we will make announcements with enough time for you to get ready. And that is what I have to say about the term test so far, okay? And that's it, guys. We need the session today. It's been a long session, a very fruitful section. And I hope it's been useful, and we keep in touch, okay? Have a nice week, next week. Catch up with the readings, make the most of the rest of the activities and the time that you have, and we will continue to work hard to give you more feedback, videos, etc. All of those things you found so useful. Be ready to work hard in the remainder of the first half of the year. Take good care of yourselves. Bye-bye.